Welcome to Adapt It, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is
Pat?
And KJ.
Today we'll be discussing The Lord of the Rings from 1954 and seeing how well its adaptation, The Lord of the Rings from 2001, reached its audience. We bring this forward. We'll talk about The Lord of the Rings, the books, which were published in the 1950s as sort of a sequel or continuation of The Hobbit, which was published in the late 1930s. And they were written by J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the most important medieval philologist of his day and probably of the 20th century. And so he's immensely important in that world. But he writes these three books, which he intended for them to be published as one, but the publisher said, God, no, and had him publish them independently. No one thought they were going to be successful. They actually published, I think, half of the amount of the third book, The Return of the King, under the expectation no one would buy these things. And so The Return of the King became briefly very expensive because there was a huge demand for it. And it became this huge hit. And it is probably, I think, one of the best-selling books of the 20th century.
All time, I'm sure.
Maybe one of the best-selling
It
books
is.
of
I
all
know
time.
it's one of the. I think there's only like 6 books that have sold over like 100 million copies, and it's one of them. So
Oh, yeah. And it's interesting. It is not reminiscent of the era in which it was written at all. And it sort of independently starts the fantasy genre. It attracted a tremendous amount of attention. There's actually now a decent amount of scholarship on Lord of the Rings, really starting in the 1970s. And yet it hadn't really been adapted. There's a few cartoons we could talk about. The Return of the King, The Hobbit, we mentioned this in last week's opening impressions. But it wasn't until years later that Peter Jackson managed to take a whack at it. And there had been an attempt earlier, and Tolkien had seen the screenplay, and he just went at the screenplay with a red ink pen. He saw a copy of the screenplay, and it is currently housed somewhere. You could actually see the screenplay with Tolkien's notes on it. But that was one of the reasons why I didn't really get that far. But Jackson got the opportunity, and part of it was, I think, the CGI reached a certain level where it could be used. And also, Jackson sort of sold the movie as only costing X number of dollars, got to produce all three of the movies at the same time. And when the budget passed $X, he was able to argue for more money because they had already filmed so much of it. And so it was kind of Jackson's negotiating powers that got it brought to the table. And obviously, if you're listening to this, you're probably a Lord of the Rings fan. They were immensely successful. The third movie, The Return of the King, had tied for the most Oscar nominations of all time. I don't know how valuable that is, but it's certainly interesting. And the movie is held up as really, or the movies, I should say, are held up as really excellent cinema. And the extended editions that were released to DVD extended that sort of fandom and that excitement about the movies. And the extended editions are, I think, better than the original editions. And I think probably you guys agree with me. And I think, Pat,
for the
you've
most
told
part, yeah.
me. Yeah. And yet there is still the scholarly Tolkien community that started really in the 1970s that doesn't really like the movies that much. They have a lot of problems with the movies, and they sort of compete, it seems, with how nitty gritty you can be in your problems with the adaptations of the movies, which seems both profoundly silly to me, but some of the differences between the books and the movies are interesting. And I think that when you look at what Tolkien's doing and when you look at Jackson, what Jackson is doing, it's not so much which one is better or did Jackson fail to capture the essence of blah, 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 which I kind of find a little irritating, but what the intentions of these different artists are and what the difference between the intentions leads us to observe in these different works. So I will open it up here. Ask the first question that we always ask. And since this is the first full episode, I'm guessing we will always ask it, which is, do we think this Peter Jackson adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was successful? Were the characters and narrative captured in the adaptation? Does the adaptation successfully take advantage of the film medium?
Yes, I think it's a success. I think it's probably as close of a success as you're gonna get. As Tom said, there's very few novels that sort of get that status as just being great, or great films from novels that sort of get that status. I mean, probably examples are things like The Godfather is always thrown out there, Gone with the Wind, those are your, even I think Ben-Hur, is another classic. Like a lot, they are out there. But I think this is the one that's probably the best. And I think the reason it is partially because of what you were just suggesting, Tom, is that it uses the medium of film far in a way that Tolkien can't do it. It has to make certain changes to it, and sometimes those changes I think are good, and sometimes I do think there are problems with some of the changes. One of the great examples, I think, though, of just like where it succeeds, where the book, generally speaking, would fail. An example of that is, and I remember Peter Jackson says this in the commentary on the extended edition DVDs. He's talking about the Battle of Helm's Deep, and he says very specifically, if you in the Two Towers, that section of the book is like 3 pages. It's an incredibly brief segment. It's essentially just, and then the orcs arrived, and then they did this, and then this thing happened, and then the tunnel blew, and then they came in. It's not cinematic at all. It's just not what Tolkien was really trying to do. Tolkien isn't particularly cinematic, and I think that that's a section that does, generally speaking, sort of fall flat. I don't think you get the drama. I don't think you get the sensation of what's really going on, and I think that does translate extremely well into the film. That being said, there are others. That's a section where he takes a few pages of the book and sort of expands it and makes it very successful. There's other sections in the book because of the way film works, and we might get into this a little later, I think, but I won't get too much into details. But because of the way film works in shorthand a lot. So it has to gloss characters, or it has to do things with characters that probably wouldn't work in a book, or that you don't need to do in a book, but you have to do in the film, because otherwise the film just doesn't work. And I think the great example of that is probably one of the more controversial things that gets changed in the book, which is Boromir, and how or Faramir, who, when he's presented in the book, when he meets Bill, or he meets Frodo with the ring, Faramir essentially just says, if I saw the ring in a gutter, I wouldn't pick it up, or something like that. And Peter Jackson, again, this is in the DVD commentaries, fairly accurately says, I can't do that. Like in a book, you can sort of get away with it because you've got a long time to develop a character and explore a character and explore a theme. So if Tolkien wants to have one human character who can reject the ring out of hand, you sort of, as a reader, have enough time to digest it and think about it as you read and explore the character. But Peter Jackson says, and he goes, I have now spent at this point like 4.5, 5 hours showing how this ring, no one can say no to it. It's the most tempting thing on earth. I cannot have a character show up now and say, I wouldn't pick it up if I found it in a gutter. He's like, I can't do it. If I do it, there's a whole bunch of problem. Again, we might get into a little later, but there's a whole bunch of problems that are going to extend from that in a film. And so he rewrites that character and sort of alters that character. And I think amongst the many things people have an issue with oftentimes in this, that's, I think, a primary one, that they change the character of Faramir quite a bit by doing that. So I think that it is a successful adaptation. I think it uses film in a way that in a cinematic way that Tolkien doesn't do, but it does also, I think, have to alter some things. There's other things I don't think he has to alter, and maybe we'll get to those later too. But I think that overall, it's a successful adaptation, despite the sort of things that do get changed that might be niggly and annoying.
So, Pat, you mentioned Ben-Hur, and I'm hoping AI gets strong enough that we get to rewatch these films with Charlton Heston playing both Boromir and Aragorn. Wouldn't that be like how would Charlton Heston say Gondor has no king, Gondor needs no king to himself as he's disgusted walking away? Like that would be
Fair enough.
Free men of the West. Like
Why
it's
doesn't he? Why not just cast him in every role? I'd like to see him as a hobbit.
Wizard's never late, Frodo. He
Yeah,
arrives precisely when he means to.
I think he could be a hobbit. I think he could be a wizard. I think he could be every character. I bet you, try it. I think you could go to ChatGPT right now and ask it to show you the movie entirely cast with Josh Hutcherson.
I just imagine instead of the eye of Sauron, it's just his head looking back and forth.
Laughing manically like in Planet of the Apes. But another way Peter Jackson absolutely took advantage of film is the score. The score is incredible. He Peter Jackson proved to be an incredible filmmaker, and it was almost like he used Lord of the Rings to show us how good a film could be, which it was just surprising for me.
I mean, I have to say, I mean, I will at least say it was surprising in the sense that my expectations were fairly low.
Mhm.
I remember when they came out because the only, as Tom has said, the only adaptation that far that I've seen of Lord of the Rings was the cartoon, which is wildly unimpressive. And I think what was Peter Jackson's big thing? Didn't he? What was he? He did The Faculty, right? Wasn't he The Faculty?
Did he do The Faculty? He did a
What was the
few
one he
movies.
did? He
He
did
did with
some. He did
Michael
like
J. Fox. He did The Haunting, I
maybe it's
believe.
The Haunting.
And
Actually,
he
I'm thinking
did
of, yeah.
another movie with Kate Winslet that was also a sort of rather sexual horror movie.
Yeah, and that's again, yeah, maybe it was The Haunting, it wasn't The Fact, but anyway, whatever it was, he did not have a particularly impressive resume up to that point. It's a shock that they let him do it, but I think it clearly it was the right decision.
Part of it too is is he a New Zealander or Australian? He knows that area of the world and he uses the New Zealand landscape in order to capture Middle Earth. And I think that is the strongest aspect of I would just say I think it's the strongest aspect of both the book and the movie is landscapes, is the kind of world creation. And Jackson, I feel, honors that really well. And I think even the critics who are deeply disappointed or angry at these movies for their various reasons, which we can get into, at least agree things like Lothlorien or Hobbiton, the Shire, he gets right. I mean, they look really great,
Yeah,
and it might
they're
be the case.
gorgeous. They're
Yeah,
absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
and it might be Jackson's just where he is from in the world that allows him to kind of be the best scoutmaster, location scoutmaster, to find these places to kind of set up Middle Earth. But even that's not really doing him justice because he layers these scenes with these kind of almost like horror movie effects, like the Mirror of Galadriel scene when they're in Lothlorien and they meet Kate Winslet. The way he does that scene, like she's occasionally talking, occasionally it's these like voiceovers in people's head, occasionally it's voiceover while she's talking, and it's kind of haunting. And granted, it's ethereal and she's angelic and all that type of thing, but you get the impression, which I think is really important and really interesting, that yes, she's this kind of angelic and beautiful figure, but she can also be a very, very bad person to have the ring. She can be very terrifying if she gets that ring. And I think that comes out of kind of Jackson's horror film sensibility. In the same way, like if you saw Spider-Man 2, a lot of that comes out of Sam Raimi's horror film sensibility as well. So I think these horror film directors may have something a little more going for them. Or like Francis Ford Coppola, I think did horror movies with Roger Corman before he moved on up to the big time.
Yeah, I think it's the pacing. It's the making you feel safe and then breaking that safety zone. That's what gives you that idea that she's angelic, but can be terrible because when you felt safe, all of a sudden she was getting into your head, or they do that inverting of the film for her when she says you'll have a terrible queen instead of a
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it's the pacing of those voiceovers with the internal monologue and her talking.
Mhm. Yeah, and the music always seems to be perfect. Yeah.
Mhm. What about you, Tom? Do you think this was a successful adaptation?
I do, and my ideas, and I put them in the notes because I got carried away with thinking about this, was, um, I think it was a successful adaptation, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of art and set direction. I think it's a huge reason why this was successful. And it was the idea with Tolkien is there's one scholar who's the editor of the Tolkien Encyclopedia, Michael D.C. Trout, and he described what Tolkien is doing as he's doing real scholarship with fake work. And so Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxonist. He studied, his big thing was Beowulf, but he studied a number of Anglo-Saxon texts, and he was a philologist. He studied the history of words in order to understand how these dead languages were actually communicating and what they were trying to say with these poetries and whatnot. And that's what he's doing in the Lord of the Rings, especially if you read the appendix or the appendices. He's doing philology work. He's just making up the languages and making up the stuff. And so, like, the richness of Lord of the Rings is the fact that he's just made up these fake cultures and like got really, really into it. Apparently, he got into it for decades before he actually wrote Lord of the Rings. Like he wrote the Silmarillion in like the 30s and was just developing it, and then only later developed the Lord of the Rings after he had the kind of mythos and languages all set up. And so that's the kind of depth in this book. I think that translates. You can't really translate that into a movie, right? You can't make it into a philological experiment in the book. That frame narrative doesn't, like, what are you going to do, have them all speaking Elvish and the dwarf language all the time and only have footnote, what I mean, like, that's not even philology, that's just subtitles. But I think what Jackson and his team does in order to kind of get at what Tolkien is doing is creating very, very specific art and set direction and not always explaining it. Like, there's this one scene I remember where, towards the end of Fellowship, where Bilbo is being confronted by Boromir, right? This is right before Boromir attempts to steal the ring. And Bilbo's by this like statue head that's clearly from this old statue that has fallen over. And that's where the scene is going. And nobody comes out and is like, by the way, this statue is this person who's blah, blah, blah. So you just get the sense of like, oh, this world is very lived in. And there's this culture or these cultures that are going on. And some of them are there and some of them have passed. And the art and set stuff really creates that sense of depth that Tolkien's kind of bizarre fixation, I guess not bizarre, it was his day job after all, but his fixation on language does in the book.
The other thing, I mean, I'll just throw out, I mean, I agree. I think that, there is a sense of parallel here that if Tolkien spent a lot of time getting the background of his story set in his own mind, such that it doesn't feel like anything's accidental, it doesn't feel like anything sort of is appearing, everything seems to have a reason, even if you don't necessarily know what it is. I'll contrast that with, say, someone who does not do that, and I'm sure somebody will get mad at me criticizing this one, but it's like Harry Potter. You read Harry Potter, like you don't get the sense that, like, yeah, there's a mythos here, but it does feel like it's just made up. Like, this doesn't feel like, oh, this is like could be a real mythology from a real place. Like, it doesn't have that. It just doesn't have that sense because it lacks the sort of depth that's behind it that I think that Tolkien puts into it. But I do think that that does translate into the film as well for the reasons you gave, Tom. I think there's other things that even the audience doesn't see. There's a great one that I remember they talk about, where the actor who plays Theoden at the end, he's talking about how in his armor that he wears at Helm's Deep, and he says he went to go put the armor on. They had like smiths making their actual armor, and he said on the inside of his armor they'd like emblazoned a giant sun on the inside of it. And he's like, no one will see this. This is absolutely zero impact on the film itself, but basically this idea that they weren't faking it. This was the idea, was like, this will be armor for a king, it has to be special. And so they were doing things even for the actors, for everything going on, and even if you can't see it, I do think a lot of that comes through.
Yeah, it is a lived world, certainly.
I wonder if that's an important ingredient for a good adaptation. If the original author spent a lot of time doing research, backstory makes it sound cheap, but setting up the infrastructure, when you adapt that source, should you also be spending a lot of time doing the infrastructure? Might be interesting moving forward to see which authors followed the same creative process as
Mhm.
the source.
It's interesting because it's like what I think makes the movie work so well, and I think that what your example shows especially is that it's a difference in method in order to create depth. Right? Jackson is not exact. He's not exactly doing the same thing Tolkien's doing. Tolkien's whole thing is, and I just love the phrase of it's real scholarship on fake material. Tolkien's whole thing is that I'm going to perform scholarship, and that's the whole thing. Where audience, I sent these guys a text about the Red Book of, oh God, what was it called? The Red Book of March, the Red Book of West March. And the Red Book of West March is this weird thing. It's in the Appendix F of the Return of the King, and it's basically like where Tolkien is saying he got the Lord of the Rings from. And it was the Red Book, which we see in the movie is the book that Frodo finishes. And apparently he gives it to Sam, and Sam like gives it to Pippin, and Pippin takes it to Gondor, and they transcribe it there, and the transcription comes back, and then it gets transcribed, and then it gets, and all this stuff is in Appendix F. And Tolkien's point is like, oh yeah, I got like the translation of the translation of the translation of the Red Book of Westmarch, and this is what I've done. And the initial translation is from Bilbo. It's like translated by Bilbo Baggins. And then it's, I got this information, and then Tolkien edited it and translated it for us, which is why there's a bunch of footnotes, because it's a scholarly edition of this old text he found. So that's the whole point of this, is like this like weird scholarly fiction thing that he wanted to do. And even if you read like in the appendix, like apparently hobbit is not the right word for hobbits. Like according to Tolkien, it's like no one actually says the word hobbit in Middle Earth. That's a word I just made up because I needed a better word than what was there. Here's actually the words they used. And you have like a bunch of like Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon words. And he's like, this word means this word means half person, this means halfling, this is what they did. No one actually says hobbits. I'm just using that to translate easier. And it's like, holy crap, this is really like you are really performing this to an extent. And I don't think Tolkien's like excuse me, I don't think Jackson is doing that. Like Jackson can't. It's a movie. He can't be like, I found this film in a library somewhere. Like that
But I
doesn't,
mean, that does happen. I mean, but this it
that's
well,
found footage, yeah.
that's what I say, but that's sort of the found footage, and I feel like those things always come across as gimmicky. I mean, that's like the
Mhm.
Blair Witch kind of thing. And even the example you gave, there are other books that have done that, where it's like, oh, this is an actual text that I found, and it's this is a scholarly thing. The one that pops into my mind is *Handmaid's Tale*.
Oh
But
yeah.
those are gimmicks. Those
Mhm.
are gimmicks that are meant to either tie the thing together or explain where the thing came from or whatever it happens to be. But they're gimmicks. They're not actually, they're not meant to contribute to the world really. They're meant to sort of have the audience sort of be like, oh, I didn't see that coming. I feel like, but to your point, there is a significant sense here that, like, yeah, this is you are trying to get this to be as real as he possibly could get it. At least the book goes. But anyway, for the film, keep going. Sorry.
Was the in Fellowship, the extended edition, it starts with Bilbo writing the book.
Mhm.
That's the opening scene, and I don't really remember which of the endings of Return of the King have Frodo kind of finishing,
Mhm.
or at least finishing that draft. Like you're saying, it goes on from there.
The original definitely, the real one definitely has him give the book to Sam and say, "Now the last pages are for you."
Oh,
That is
right.
definitely in the original,
Mhm.
not the director's cut. I do confuse them quite frequently, but I'm positive that one's in there.
So Peter Jackson does try to do it a little bit, but now I'm imagining something more like Passion of the Joan of Arc,
Mhm.
where the opening is like, here's documentation found, right?
Yeah.
That would have went too far, I think.
Yeah, maybe you could have done that where you're like, here is the court transcriptions of the trial of Joan of Arc. Now here we're going to enact that or something like that. Um,
I'm just picturing here the court transcriptions of Sauron, like Saruman,
yeah,
actually of
yeah, I know.
Saruman, right?
Yeah, it
In
doesn't
the
work
Shire, like I don't know, yeah,
because they were actually court transcriptions. They showed you at the beginning,
right,
so
right,
we
for
don't have to
Passion.
pretend this didn't happen. Here we have the thing. But I think Jackson's way of dealing with Tolkien's performance, I think it's best that he doesn't lean into that he doesn't do this bizarre version of found footage, which just wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have made any sense. Like we can't pretend that this is a real thing we found with with this CGI and all that. And so it's just instead, it's just I'm going to make this world as deep as possible.
Hang on, guys, hang on.
It's
I'm
designed.
struggling. I'm struggling. So you're saying found footage in Middle Earth?
Yeah,
Like
wouldn't
they
I'm saying
found
you
a bunch
can't
of
do that. That's
you
the point. Is
can't
you
do that.
can't.
That's the
right,
point.
right. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
It would be complete nonsense.
Even without
You
the
can't.
CG.
you
No, but
can't
that's I guess
do
that's the point. Is
is
like you
doing.
can't pretend like the Lord of the Ring. Tolkien is trying to pretend that the Lord of the Rings, the book, is real, or at least is based on a real historical text. Like that's he's trying. Essentially, he was just using it to justify the languages that he created. He was like, well, I made these languages. Now let me write a mythology to explain where the languages came from. This is, I think that's what the books really are sort of are. That's kind of I think how he looked at them to some extent. But you can't do that with the movies. Like you can't, it would be just total gibberish. It would be stupid.
Mhm.
But I think there is a sense though that this is a truly real world in a way that most films don't do. They don't even try it.
Mhm.
They're almost a lot of them spend. I guess the biggest thing is a lot of them spend a lot of time kind of winking at you. They sort of acknowledge that the fantasy world, like it's hard to carry that into sort of film. I mean, Game of Thrones kind of tries to do that. Game of Thrones does have a general sense that it is a lived world, and I know we're doing that later in this podcast, and it'd be an interesting discussion. What is the efficacy between Lord of the Rings's attempt to create a lived-in world and Game of Thrones' attempt to create a lived-in world? I think that'll be an interesting discussion to sort of have later.
No, but I think that's a good point. I think maybe one of the reasons why this works so well and other things don't is there is no sense of everything being explained. Right. And I think part of it, it's not just that the armor is real down to the interior of the armor that the audience can't see. Like they care about what the inside of the armor looks like. It's also, you're not going to get an explanation of every reference these people make, right? When they're saluting whatever or whomever, or like the old kings of Numenor or whoever the hell they were. There's a lot of periphery and there's a lot of reference that the characters understand but that we don't understand. So that the characters can say something, they can understand it, but we don't. It's sort of like the opposite of dramatic irony. And I think that really doesn't happen as much in the dialogue as it does in the kind of the settings and the world itself. Um,
I think Tolkien called that you irony instead of dramatic.
Thank you.
Sorry, audience. That was a pretty specific Tolkien joke right there. Video.
That's an
It'll be
awfully
explained
specific
later.
Tolkien joke. Yeah. No, we won't explain it to create a
To
lived
create
sense
you
of world.
irony, the host
I will
understood.
also I will throw out though that the book it does do that a little bit where it will reference things. I mean, to your point, like the kings of Numenor, like they don't really reference that. I mean, the sort of famous one online is the one that's sort of the memes or the where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? Like they
Mhm,
don't bother to be like, what was the Westfold? The Westfold was, and then
mhm,
they kind of like that's what would happen if you had a bad writer would be like, the Westfold was the blah blah blah. My father died. They would go
yeah.
on about it.
Mhm,
They would make a big deal of it. I do think that's one of the so in that sense they do kind of he does it occasionally with the dialogue, but I think it's better when you do it the way you're referring to, Tom, which is just sort of like there's just pieces of the world and things that are just there and they don't need an explanation, because the biggest problem you can fall into is the fantasy trope, which is just the more made up words there are in the thing, the worse it is, because as you sort of continue to get into some of these things when they're like, and this is the sword of Glonful, who used it when he defeated the lords of Blendlefill on the fields of Glothplot. Like those are often the ones where you're just like, for the love of God, like we get it, you're trying to create a lived-in world, but that there is a sense where that happens, and a lot of bad fantasy writers do that to give their worlds a feel of history and a feel of being lived in, and it's gloss, and I think that it doesn't work when you don't if you the author don't know what it is, it doesn't work.
mhm,
You really need to have almost this enormous amount of background material that you know about as the author, but it never shows up in your work. I'm reminded of like there's a trope, with writers when writers are doing historical fiction, they'll often say like, I think there's some, I can't remember who she is. There's a fairly famous, she does, historical fiction. And she basically says like she takes like 10 years to write one of her books. And she says, usually by the time I've, sort of done all my research on something, I've effectively written like a doctoral thesis on that time period. But she goes, pretty much nothing that I've researched ends up in the book. She goes, it's mostly just stuff that it layers in and it informs my writing in a way that I don't even know that it's there. But it's just sort of like I might make references to stuff and I might pull stuff in, but I don't even notice that it's there. Because the biggest mistake you can make is to just sort of Google something and be like, what was such and such, and then just throw it into your historical fiction. That's what a lot of bad fantasy does, is just throw stuff in and just to sort of give it that feel. Tolkien doesn't do that, and I don't think this film adaptation does that either.
Mhm.
I think George R. R. Martin does do that a bit. So maybe we
Yeah,
continue.
my understanding with George R. R. Martin, and it's the second chapter explains it thing, where you have the first chapter is an action chapter where a big thing happens or something creepy happens and something interesting happens. And in the second chapter, there's a meeting and everybody somehow, for some reason, has to do the thing where they're like, as you know, in our world, magic works like this. Da, 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 da. And it's like, yes, I do know that. Also, did you know? Da, 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 da. Yes, I did know that. Thank you for reiterating. It goes from there. Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, the Council of Elrond chapter, I think this is one of the best, this is not a question, but one of the best parts of the adaptation of this from Fellowship, which I reread today for this podcast, is the Council of Elrond adaptation, which is, do you guys remember that chapter from the first part of the Fellowship?
I don't remember anything specific about it, but
Oh,
Vaguely, I
it's,
remember it going on and on
it
and
goes
on.
on and on. I was,
Oh, and I know Peter Jackson moved some of it to the very front of the film, which I
mhm.
think was a brilliant move to
Yeah.
here are the stakes.
Yeah, exactly. He moves a lot of it to the front of the film. He moves some of it in other places, but like in the book, it's I remember reading, I think it was Tom Shipley, who's a Shippey rather, who's a Tolkien scholar, who's writing, and he's like, I keep trying to count how many people speak or are introduced in this scene, and always lose track. I think it's 23 different characters are introduced
Wow.
and speak, but I can never keep track. And he's like, it's like a bad academic meeting where the council, where like the committee chair just loses control of the meeting and everybody says whatever they want for like 20 minutes. It's awful. Um, and I think that's one of the best parts of the adaptation is like the Council of Elrond scene in Fellowship is streamlined and works very well.
I do think that there is a sense here of this is again, this is as far as adaptation go, this is one of the reasons why things have to move around, because I think it would be an absolutely massive mistake if Tolkien opens up his book by saying there was a ring and it was because now I have to spend a decent chunk of the beginning of that book going, okay, I got it. I know what the ring is. I know. I don't need all of this discussion, right? You don't need it in a book, and it would irritate you to have to spend all this time watching Bilbo fuddle around, or Frodo fuddle around with this thing and not do something. The film, though, so that's why in the film you're sort of sitting there, in the book you're sort of sitting there, you don't really know what it is for a long time. You've seen it in The Hobbit, now you're sort of finding out more about it, and it slowly, gradually becomes obvious. You learn more and more about it as the book progresses. With the film, though, I think your point about knowing what the stakes are really quickly, KJ, is exactly right. Because if you don't know, and you're watching all these people for the first 45 minutes make a big deal about this ring and you don't know what it is, you as an audience member are going to be like, who the cares? Like,
Why?
why?
Right.
Why are they all making such a big deal about this ring? In a book, you can do that because there's a sense of development. In a film, you're just going, and no matter who you are, you're going to get irritated wondering why they care so much about this thing. So you have to tell them at the beginning.
Hmm.
It's just a difference in how these media work. you
Absolutely.
Yeah.
you have to make that adjustment. You have to kind of change things.
Hmm.
It's the reason why some of the changes that Peter Jackson makes are necessary. I think that The biggest problem is when he makes those type of changes, but he really alters what the book did. I think the Faramir example is one of the primary ones. The other, another important one I think is the one with when Bilbo in Return of the King, when Bilbo sends Sam away and says like, you need to go home, Sam, and Sam goes for some reason. It's sort of
Mhm.
like I get it. It's sort of like otherwise this trio becomes very dull, so
Mhm.
he needs to create some character drama, but it's an odd sort of way to create it, and it kind of speaks oddly to the character. So I don't think that one works. But I do think there's making adjustments between the source material and the film in order to meet the dictates of what film does is an important thing this film does well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people or critics have complained about, critics aren't people, that they've complained about
That's why I
with
always
this.
love that's why I always love the commercials that will say this commercial is with real people, not actors, because actors aren't people.
That's also true. Um, yeah, scholars are not people, critics are not people, actors are not people. End of show. Um, but one of the complaints is like, which is a bizarre one, which is that the fight sequences are fight sequences. It didn't even seem to be that the idea seemed to be that, well, Tolkien doesn't really write a lot of fight sequences, which he doesn't. I mean, whenever there's a fight sequence, it's pretty brief. Like you mentioned with Helm's Deep, it's like
Only a
two
few
pages.
pages.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
a
a
few
couple pages. Yeah.
pages. There's almost none of that in Fellowship. The big fight at the end of Fellowship, the movie, happens at the beginning of Two Towers, the book. So part of it's that, but a lot of times, like in Fellowship, there's a little bit of the fighting in the Mines of Moria, but it's not very long. I mean, the whole time when they're battling the whatever they are, the orcs in the mine or whatever it is, and the cave troll, um, that's that's a page, and there's a few pages on the Balrog, but m- there's no fighting in it. There's virtually no fighting in the book, and the scholars seem to love that. But with a movie, you do need that sort of bang, bang, bang. You need that excitement. You need that kind of choreography. Because I think a description, and this is something that the media do differently, a description of a fight can be exciting, but un, it's not as exciting as other things you can do, right? Other descriptions, very lush descriptions of landscape or something like that, can be just as interesting. But with a movie, like a movie is so like visual and loud and all this stuff. Like fight sequences can be really fun to watch, and I think the fight sequences in these movies are really fun. And Jackson somehow keeps the stakes up. Like each fight sequence seems to be a little more exciting than the one before. So that complaint I always found odd, but I think it's another good translation Jackson does. He's really good at these kind of war sequences that happens. I mean, Helm's Deep is really, really cool. That whole sequence is
Yeah.
I
really
think that's
cool.
my favorite sequence in the whole movie. I think I'm in the minority, and I say Two Towers is my favorite, but I think it is partially because I love that sequence.
Mhm.
Wow. The my only issue with Helm's Deep, I love it. It's great, great fight scene. Thematically, I feel like Peter Jackson breaks the rules here. The elves show up to save the day, and if
Yeah, that
it's
was weird. I don't know
right,
why
this
he
is the
Mhm.
did that.
coming of
I don't
age
know
of
why he did that.
men.
And I guess this is partially the thing is like this is I guess that and that's a totally legitimate criticism I would say and that one did irritate me because there are cases where you do need to alter the thing in order to make it work as I've tried to argue, but that one was like
It
why?
came out of nowhere. It
There
could have
is
been the
Mhm.
trees, right? I mean, I guess it's
there
still
is
not the coming of the age of men at that point, but it could have been the trees.
and it's just there's absolutely no necessity. There's none. I guess it kind of raises the stakes a little bit, but there's really no arguable reason why. Like you could cut that, and the film has no major differences. I don't think the film suffers. I don't think it gains that much by it. So
Mhm.
why do that? I don't. That I
Yeah.
agree. That's a
Mhm.
big problem with it. Now, one thing I will just throw out, Tom, is that, like
Mhm.
discussing that is that I do think you're right. And I think that this is in literature, there are very few, I can't think of any books that do battle scenes well. Because usually most literature I can think of do battles in one of two ways. They either sort of do like the Red Badge of Courage style, which is one character running around on a on battle with no idea what's going on. And so you usually sort of have like, you get a feel for what a battle is like, but you have
Mhm.
no idea really what's going on with it. Or they do sort of the Song of Roland style, which is you have a battle and then you watch like one character's experience and how they kill a whole bunch of people, and then you watch another character's experience and watch them kill a whole bunch of people, and then you watch another which this is probably closer to the way that Peter Jackson films it. There is this sort of like, okay, now we're going to show Gimli and Legolas's experience of what's going on in the battle, and now we're going to show, you know, Aragorn's experience of what's going on in the battle. That it has almost more of a Song of Roland type experience of literature, but very few books really do that sort of grand cinematic well. They often are either really long, or you get like War and Peace or something, where you just have these really long sequences, and they just don't. I don't think they work very well. Cinema does it. It's something cinema does that just film that literature can't do
Can't
very well.
do. Yeah, and with literature, what you get, I can think of War and Peace by comparison. Like when you have that kind of battle where in War and Peace at one point, like the main character sees the Tsar on the battlefield, and like he's compelled to really fight hard because he like loves the Tsar so much once he's seen him, and all these types of things. And you have the other main character who's like on the battlefield and sort of falls in love with the peasants who get arrested with him by Napoleon and all this thing. Like you sort of, it works best when like one image on the battlefield sparks an internal chain or monologue or something like that, um, which isn't particularly cinematic again. And so it's just like, this is what this guy thought about the czar in the midst of all these bullets. And it's like the given circumstances are interesting, and the thought is interesting in relation to the given circumstance. But it's not a visual thing, right? It's just not, it's something you read. It's not something you experience in audio or with your eyes. And so like the Lord of the Rings just has to pump up those battle sequences. Um, and I think it does it well. And I think like one of the complaints was they use too much CGI, which I don't think is true at all. I think it's used pretty reasonably in this movie. Maybe the cave troll doesn't look as well as it would today, but like who cares? I think it is used sparingly and artistically.
And maybe in 2001 it felt like a lot. I don't know how much,
I
right?
but this is post Star prequels.
Well, it's in the middle of them.
Right. When does Star Wars Phantom Menace? That's the second one,
99.
right? Oh,
Phantom
okay.
Menace is episode 1, 99. And then it was every 3 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
yeah.
the third one came out after Return of the King.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it came
Because I
out my
remember this.
sophomore year. Came out my sophomore year. Return of the King came out my freshman year.
Because I remember like
We
the
are
second Star.
old.
Yeah, I guess I remember like the second Star Wars is like the grand example of how not to use CGI, I think. But regardless, I think this movie uses it sparingly, is my
Well, this
point.
movie does a very good job. I mean, there's a great, it's sort of almost the ideal balance between doing like sort of old school film techniques when it could and CGI when it could. There's a great, I remember watching once, I think it was when the third one came out. I vividly remember this was like watching Ian McKellen during on like Conan, and they were like, okay, and Sir Ian, what scene are we going to see? And he goes, it will be some sort of scene of me talking very seriously with a young man on his knees beside me because they're just pretending to be hobbits. And he was basically like, and basically apparently all the hobbits just walked around on their knees when they were around there because he was like, yeah, but I think it's funny because that was how they did that. They were like, yeah, we're just gonna have them walk around on their knees. Whereas now I think they would be like, no, we have to computerize them. They will be computerized hobbits. Every single person will show their knees so that people know they're really walking. It'd be like, no one cares.
Yeah.
No one noticed this. And even there's the sequence when Theoden gets released, and he's like, I release you. And he gets, released from the spell. And I don't think it's CGI. I think it's just a series of individually shot sequences where they slowly removed the makeup from his face and slowly adjusted it and then just strung those in a sequence together. Like it's not CGI. It's old school, like what you would have done with that effect 30 years ago, 50, 100 years, not 100 years ago, but 80
Mhm.
years ago. And that's how you would have done that. You would have taken a whole bunch of individual stills and placed them next to each other. And I think that's what they do there. And so you can tell like what's CGI versus what's not. And yeah, the CGI doesn't age that great. Some of it's looks a little wonky. But that's just part of the thing. But I do think it sort of strikes the balance between being just all green screen and being, hey, you know what, we're gonna do this thing for real. We're just gonna, use prosthetics, or we're gonna use, we're gonna have, we're gonna have a double do this kind of thing. Like I think there's a lot of sequences I've seen is so funny, like you see online of like some films and they'll show some scene and it's like the entire thing is like one dude just floating on a green screen with like six people around doing this. I'm like, you didn't do anything. Like none of it was real.
Mhm.
So I think that it I think strikes a good balance between the two.
Mhm. Yeah, that's probably a different discussion, but it is amazing how often CGI is used and how unsatisfying it often is. It's rarely satisfying, and I think people really do want non-CGI stuff, which is odd because people love special effects. Like special effects are cool, you like to see them, but for some reason I don't know, this thing hasn't been incorporated greatly. I would say I think it was used well in Ex Machina, but that might be a different discussion. um, anyway, so I think this question is pretty obvious. The next question we usually have, which is, did this adaptation bring the source to more people? Did the adaptation reach the audience better than the source? I think the question, I mean, obviously, it brought it to more people, right?
Yeah, I mean, movies in general will,
Mm,
fantastic movies will, and a whole new generation is
yeah.
another, right? These were pretty spaced out. Even
Mm,
though a lot of us were still reading the books, I think more people will now read the books because of the movies.
I think it ensured like if this movie doesn't come out, I think Lord of the Rings is still around in 50 years, but I think it has a more niche sort of following. Like I think my dad read the books to me. I've read them a couple times since then, but I think I'll read them to my kids and my kids, but I guarantee you, my sister would not be familiar with them. A lot of other people would not be familiar with them. They wouldn't have as much of a following. I think this sort of cements the books and the film in culture for a very, very, very long time. I think these will, if you were to ask me like what books that we currently have will still be read in 1,000 years, most of everything that exists nowadays is never going to survive. Even the good stuff is not going to make it. I think this has a solid shot of making it.
mm. Yeah, part of it is the cottage industry that has sprung up from the movies, right? I mean, there's the like even the online role playing games, those kind of MOOC things are consequences of the movies more so than the books. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is a consequence of the books. I mean, Gary Gygax made it from really Lord of the Rings and had to change things so as not to get sued by the Tolkien estate. But yeah, it does seem like the like would you call like the trail of plastic that has come after after the release of these movies has in a certain way created a cultural energy around it. And now that we're 20 years separated from the first movie, I don't
20 years separated from the third
The
movie.
third movie, yeah.
from the third movie.
The
Oh God.
third movie came out in 2003. So I
Uh,
said we are old, boy.
uh, I don't like that. I don't like that. But yeah, I mean, it's been 20 years. I still feel like these movies are really well received and well talked about and kind of handed down in the way like the Star Wars trilogy is handed down. People still will show like The Empire Strikes Back to their kids.
The only risk is they're so long, they may not last as long as Star Wars. It's easier to show a 2 hour movie than, a 3 or 4 hour movie.
I would agree with that with the extended editions because
Mm.
I like the extended editions, but the extended editions do sometimes have this is where pacing kind of comes in, and I get why they cut sequences. My favorite is like I loved Treebeard reading the poem,
Mm.
reciting the poem as he carries them through the woods. But it's also like, wow, you just took really a bunch of action-packed scenes and have stopped for like 6 minutes to recite poetry.
Mm,
Like, there is no you couldn't do this in a theater. You just
mhm,
couldn't do it. But I don't think the length of them matters. I don't think anyone I think a good 3-hour movie is fine. I think there are bad hour-and-a-half movies that are intolerable, and
mhm.
I don't think anyone's gonna complain about that
I
here.
think part of why people like, and I think why people like the even the extended editions is the world is so rich. Like you, Middle Earth. This is I made this comparison on another podcast I was on, comparing Middle Earth to Arrakis and Dune. It's like Dune is probably maybe not as pregnant a world, a fictional world as Tolkien's Middle Earth is, but Dune is a pretty well thought out fictional world. I mean, it's up there in like the great conceived universes. And yet no one wants to go to Dune Planet. They don't want to go to Arrakis. There's no water. There's no food. If you walk at a normal pace, a giant worm eats you. I mean, like, no one wants to go there. Everybody wants to go to Middle Earth. Everybody wants to go to like Rivendell or Lothlorien or the Shire or, even like
Mordor.
Mordor. Yeah. Like even the bad places look appealing in a certain way, right? And so I think that's part of it is like it's just fun to spend time in this universe. And I think that's kind of true of the Star Wars universe too, to a lesser extent, but I think it's just fun to spend time in a place where there's these kind of space wizards that do things. And I
I
think
would
that's
love it. It's cool. Can you imagine, like, you get to be Han Solo and go around in the ships and go to cool bars and hang
yeah,
out? Like, I always wanted to do that. It's
yeah.
cool.
But Middle Earth is just pretty, right? It's good looking. And I think that's probably why the length of the movies are also are going to be, I think they're going to be, and I think they have been tolerated well and appreciated.
I just think of, like, there are some very long movies from I was my kids put on, we watched, like, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which is, like, a great movie, but it is insanely long. It's, like, 2 hours and 20 minutes for, like, a kids movie, and, you sort of watch this thing, I'm like, "Man, why is this so long?" Like, it's insane. Even, like, we put, like, Mary Poppins is also like, some of these movies from that time period, I'm like, "Wow, these are long. You could never make this movie nowadays. It's so long." I just and there are movies from the '90s, I think the same thing about I don't think that's gonna be thought about these. I just think they move well. I've never had that experience with them, but
So the other question we had coming forward here was, do we feel the author's authority in the adaptation? And I think a lot of Tolkien people, like the people who study Tolkien and take him very, very seriously, would say no, or very little, right? He's kind of stripped out of this, and they're deeply upset about this.
So I was thinking about it a lot, and I think at first glance you're like, no, 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 it's all here. But if Tolkien really wanted to create a history for England, these movies are not that. And I think that's where I think that's where Tolkien is not in the movies.
You don't feel this is sort of England's backstory.
Right. It's a little too fantastic, and it's not any more fantastic than the books. But I think because it's presented with the sweeping score, and I think the cinematics
Mhm.
make it not feel like a history.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there is, I think Tolkien's intent, and this again is from a really good book by Tom Shippey, The Road to Middle Earth, I think from like early 1980s, 1981, 1982, something like that. But he sort of makes the argument that it's like there's a sort of history of England or history of Europe type thing, like a Germanic history going on, where like the people of like Rohan and and north of Rohan are like the like Germanic people, be they Old Norse or Gothic or Anglo-Saxon, and Mordor and those people are like the South, like Rome and the classical world, and it's sort of like, well, Rome falls because all these rational people like don't really keep it going. They sort of abandon ship when the going gets tough, but the West survived with these kind of like northern Germanic people, and there's that kind of contest going on. And I don't think that's in this book at all, in these movies at all. Um, Even though I think Shippey makes like a pretty good argument that that's kind of what Tolkien is going for. in these books. Though he's giving Rome short change, but he is an Anglo-Saxonist, so you can imagine why.
I mean, it's a little hard to make that claim. The only reason I would say is I don't think. I mean, supposedly, if you follow like where he, and I think he says this in his works, that like the place where he, the Shire is obviously England. That's where he imagined England being, but he imagined Minas Tirith as being the city of Ravenna, which
Mm.
is in Italy, um, and was, well, we don't have to get into this history of the city of Ravenna, but it's in Italy. It's lovely. They have really nice churches there if you ever get a chance to go. But it's a Ravenna is a classical Italian city. It's sort of a late Roman, pseudo early Byzantine city. So I don't think that he's necessarily totally throwing that sort of east versus west thing. I think there is an east versus west thing clearly, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure I just buy that argument that that's the whole point of what he was getting at. But
I don't
there's
think
certainly
the
some of
whole
it.
point. No, I think that tension isn't in this movie.
No, I agree. Yes. But so I guess does it follow the author's intentions? I mean, supposedly the only person in the entire, I don't know if the only person, do you know the only person in the cast who had met J.R.R. Tolkien?
Oh yeah,
One
it's
person.
Christopher Lee, right?
Christopher Lee is the only person, and supposedly he got the sort of tacit approval from J.R.R. Tolkien to play Gandalf if there was ever a film version. He was a little bitter that he didn't get it. And he, um, but and I do think, supposedly they claim that throughout the film, Lee would kind of be like, no, 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 that wasn't what that was supposed to be. That, he would sort of was the voice of Tolkien throughout. And I don't think, at least in that sense, I don't, you can see there, sort of clips of Christopher Lee at the end, sort of speaking very highly of it. I think a lot of those for pretty much, you talk to you see things with those actors. Almost every actor claims that that was the highlight. Like that's the thing that they're most proud of in their career, was the making of those films. So I think Christopher Lee kind of giving it his stamp is as close as you're gonna get to Tolkien's sort of approval of it, in the sense that, he's the only one who met him. He seems to have had a reasonable sort of grasp on everything that was going on. So in that sense, but I don't. I mean, I get it. Would Tolkien have been happy with the films? Probably not. But you sort of get the impression that Tolkien was a little bit of a curmudgeon, and I mean that in like the best way, that I'm sort of a curmudgeon. Like, these are the films that are going to get the most approval from me that have been made in the last 70 years. So, this is like I have a lot of respect for his thing. My favorite story I think I've ever heard from Tolkien is that he supposedly went to church after they changed from Latin to English, and he refused to say the English. He just continued to say everything in Latin regardless. Like, so would he have been happy with the films? Probably not. Like, I don't think you're gonna get that. I don't think that's quite the right question to ask. But were his opinions respected? I do think they were. I think all of the things we're saying, that if we're going to argue that the greatest aspect of Lord of the Rings is sort of the attention to detail that goes on behind everything that you don't get to see. It's not as if Lord of the Rings was made in order to make really good armor in the same way that Tolkien wrote them in order to justify his words. But I think this is the closest film you're going to get to that. This film was made to show off really cool places and really cool armor and swords and people. And and that's how the film works.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Tolkien would have been thrilled with an adaptation. I think generally he apparently hated adaptations of things. Like he apparently saw a stage play of The Hobbit, and according to sources, whenever
I've been in a stage version of The Hobbit, and it is
you,
bad.
oh really?
I
Maybe
played
maybe it's the
Gollum.
same play. Oh, you played
I played
Gollum?
Gollum. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, when was
yeah.
this?
I think I was in like fifth grade, sixth grade.
Oh, so you predate Andy Serkis.
Oh, it was really bad. Yeah, I
Hmm.
literally, like, this was like, really, really low budget, like
Hmm.
community theater kind of thing. Like, it was all kids, and I literally had like on like a hefty trash bag. That was like, that was my costume. I was like,
What does your Gollum sound like, if you remember?
it was probably just a copy of the cartoon one. I'll have to watch
Oh.
that again. Which I have, by the way. I have the cartoon version. I have the DVD. I got it, and I'm saving it until after I read the book to my kid, and then we'll watch the movie.
That's great.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
sweet. Yeah. Yeah. But apparently he saw either this play or a version of it, or what have you. and was like, whenever there were lines he didn't write, he would shake his head, and then he would smile when anybody said lines he did write. So apparently he was
Wow.
a bit strict with this.
Yeah, that's why I don't think he would like it. But is
Mhm.
that, that's probably not the right question. I don't think he would. I don't think he would have liked any adaptation. So
Mhm. Yeah, of any of the work. Yeah, probably not. But I do think that I do think that his, whatever you want to call it, his authority or his presence or whatnot is felt in the work, even if it's changing certain things, even if it's exaggerating certain things. Like Merry and Pippin are sort of exaggerated versions of what Tolkien wrote, but they're still versions of what he wrote,
they're
right? Like,
basically Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. It is like they're
y-
interchangeable. They're sort of like buffoonish. Like
yeah, I mean, one of them
Didi and
is.
Gogo. They're like
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, and there's also the case with Didi and Gogo. One of them is smarter than the other, right? I think like Mary is the stupid one who like trips over things and drops the armor in the well, and um,
No, that's Perry.
that's Perry.
Bergen.
Okay,
Yeah,
Mary is
Took.
the
Fool of a Took.
fool of a took. But there's one essay I was reading where like somebody makes the point like the Perry ends up going to the kind of like foolish, more vital one ends up going to the more rational Gondor, the men of Gondor, and like the more rational one, like Mary, who's a little smarter, ends up going to the Rohirrim, who are a little less, rationalistic and a little more vital. And so there's this kind of mix up that they end up having to develop because they're with the people who are sort of not like them. But whatever. I mean, regardless, they're a little more exaggerated than the characters in the book. And like the Gimli thing too, where they're like tossing dwarfs and he's like, no one tosses a dwarf. And then he's like, don't tell the elf, when they have to actually throw him in the Helm's
I
Deep
mean, I get
battle.
it is comic and it's not in the book, but again, and it does feel like that does feel sort of accurate in the sense that, you know,
It feels accurate. Yeah, it feels accurate because the book is actually pretty funny and fun. That's another thing, like comparing it to like Frank Herbert's Dune. Like Dune does not have a joke in it. This is a very serious work you're reading. Take this here. And like Lord of the Rings, like the beginning of it, it's like a lot of Hobbit stuff. Like hobbits running around and like arguing about inheritance, and it's very silly. And so I think it is true to the book. It's just exaggerated. Everything's like notched up a little bit, and I think that irritates people for whatever reason. But I don't know. Like I mean, it lightens the mood a lot, and like Lord of the Rings, like overall, like it is a heavy experience. I mean, there is a lot going on. It is a long experience. It's really kind of about like the rise and or the fall and the rise of these societies. And so like having these like comic moments seems relieving. And I don't know if that may be an issue of medium as well, right? Like can the kind of endless seriousness just not survive as well in a movie as it can in a book? But yeah, that's that. I'd say like that is something I kept comparing when I was rereading this for this episode. I kept comparing it to like because I'm not a big science fiction person or fantasy person. I just don't like a lot of them just aren't very good. Typically like they ask really interesting questions. I think science fiction especially, but they don't typically make really interesting characters. It's typically like archetype of man does stuff in interesting world.
I think
But
a lot
Dune,
of them read a little too much Joseph Conrad. Yeah, or not Joseph Conrad. Man with a Thousand Faces, the Hero with a Thousand Faces too.
oh, Campbell.
Campbell, Joseph Campbell. Is
Yeah,
it Joseph Campbell?
yeah, it's Joseph Campbell. Yeah,
Just go with
he also
Campbell.
wrote
Yeah,
Skeleton Key, right?
yeah. He wrote Skeleton Key and he wrote Hero with a Thousand Faces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's it. I think what it is, it's like you also get like with a lot of these people who are in another profession who decide to write something. Like in science fiction, sometimes it's like a lot of math guys or engineers who decide to jump into science fiction.
like Manos, The Hands of Fate. That was written by an.
Yeah, wasn't who was wrote that?
I think he was like a truck driver or something.
oh,
That's why I always have great. I mean, I know it's a bad movie, but I have
Mhm.
great respect for it because apparently it was like written by some dude on a bet that he was like, I bet I could write, direct, and produce a film. He was basically trying to argue how easy it was to write and direct a movie and produce a film, and he did it. Like he
Hmm.
was like, fine, then I'll go do it. And he wrote a screenplay, he raised money for it, and he directed a movie. So the man had no idea what he was doing, and he should pull it off.
Yeah, fair enough. And you can get an audience. Manos Hand of Fate is available on Wikipedia. You can get the whole movie on
Oh, you can.
Wikipedia.
Oh,
But yeah, and I think like, but so the ones I kind of like are Dune and Lord of the Rings, and I had read Dune fairly recently, within the last few years, and it's just this Lord of the Rings is just so much more fun. Like Dune is just it's just so serious. It's very, it's a very important. It's saying something important about the world, and I think Lord of the Rings is to a certain extent saying something about like the nature of the world we live in is something we discover. It's not just something that we make. Blah blah blah, but it's so much more fun to live in that space, I think, and I think that's why this book will probably or these books will probably last. And I think that's kind of what's true to these books. It's also true in, at least in the Peter Jackson adaptations. Like it's just a fun place to go to. And you don't even have to watch the whole movies. Once you've seen them, you can just put them on in the background and while you're cooking or doing something else. They are great background movies because it's an enjoyable place to be in. And you don't
yeah, we watched
necessarily.
them a lot in college. I feel like we had them on a lot, just like
Yeah.
just floating in the background.
Yeah, because you'd have like the 2 or 3 DVD set or
Yeah,
whatnot because they didn't fit on one DVD set. So
you had four. If you had you got that little
mm,
book one with all the extra DVDs with all the extended editions, and
yeah, I think I have yours, Pat. I think I have one of yours in my parents' house somehow.
that's possible. Yeah,
Yeah, I should
it's
give that back.
probably Return of the King. I think you have Return of the King.
Oh, maybe ever. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
Is it
Yeah,
in the
that's
computer room?
No, I think it's in my bedroom.
Oh,
My
good.
or the bed, my former bedroom, the
Because Pat,
bedroom
if
I
it
grew
was
up
in the
in.
computer room, I mean, there's no way.
Oh,
I have a new one. I think you took it like 10 years ago. I think I did get a
I
new
don't think
one
I
since then.
took it. I think when you moved out, you left a few things, and I like collected them up.
Oh, at my old apartment. Oh yeah, I left a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I have your harmonica CDs, like
Oh
harmonica
yeah, yeah,
lessons.
yeah. My harmonica. Yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
wonder what happened to that.
Yeah. I think you just left it in Holy Cross. I'm just like,
Probably. Yeah.
yeah, I'll take this, I
Yeah,
guess.
that's probably what happened to the. Yeah, because I was like,
Hmm.
I haven't had the Return of the King one in probably 18 years, so
Yeah.
that's explains where
That
that
would
went.
explain it.
Yeah, but so it's because I know the Fellowship and Two Towers. Two Towers I got right before I went to Holy Cross. Fellowship I got as a Christmas present, so I've still had those. This is probably the DVDs I've had longer than any of the DVDs ever.
Hmm.
And then I had Return of the King. I
Yeah.
got afterwards.
If you bring it back, Tom, it'll be the return of the King.
It will be the return of the king.
Sorry. High shelf, high shelf. Oh, that's all.
At
Um,
least it's not. But the thing is, at least it's not Two Towers. Because if you brought back two, I'd have two towers.
Two
mm,
towers.
Yeah,
mm.
And if he brought back the other one with a bunch of
then
people,
it'd be a Fellowship.
ship of the Fellowship.
DVDs are kind of like rings, so it'd be.
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite adaptations, just in terms of liking the original material and liking the thing itself. Probably to an equal extent. If you enjoyed The Lord of the Rings and are looking for more adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, check out the animated movie from 1978, the text-based adventure from 1985, the radio drama from 1981, or the Super Nintendo game from 1994. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the point. Where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201 467 8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss the three-body problem and look at the 2024 TV series, The Three-Body Problem.
Wow, Talking Studios